All right, I'm going to start talking. I like to start right on time and I don't like to leave too much empty airspace. As teachers know, that's when you lose your students. So I am Erica Poplinski-Burge. I was in the classroom just to tell you a little bit about myself for 18 years, every grade from pre-K to eighth grade. And now I am super excited to be at Voces Digital as a curriculum manager and a teacher trainer because I love working with other teachers. Justin, you want to say something about yourself?
Sure, gladly. I'm Justin, and Erica was actually my own kid's Spanish teacher before she transitioned to working with Voces. My kids are now 15 and 12, but she was their teacher when they were in elementary school, and they absolutely loved it. I myself have been a language teacher since 2005, mostly Latin and German, some Spanish as well. I grew up in Vienna, Austria, so German's a heart language of mine, and that's how I came to speak it. But then via Vancouver, BC, and Los Angeles, I've landed in Michigan, where I still do some teaching and also work with Voces to help other teachers and support students by supporting their teachers. And I love nerding out about this stuff as well. I'm sure if you're attending this session, you're excited for some nerdy yet practical info. So you're in for a treat.
All right, let's jump into it.
So we will be sharing won't go super deep, but throughout the session, as you saw in the description, we'll be sharing both some brain research and some linguistic research that supports our practices as language teachers. And we don't want to, neither in this session nor in our lives, do we want to feel too overwhelmed by research or get too bogged down in it, but it does have some really handy, four handy kind of features or purposes for us. The first, like Erica has shown here on the slide, is that it can give us kind of a starting point if we're trying to figure out, well, what do we even want to do in our classes? The next is that it can give us some new ideas. So maybe you'll be paying attention to this presentation and you'll hear a new thing about the brain or about linguistics. Say, ooh, that's cool. I don't really take advantage of that aspect in my classes, but now I will because I learned this thing. Next, of research can also, if it's something that we already do, maybe some research will tell us why that thing we do actually works. And that can help us not only be confident instead of second guessing ourselves, but also, last but not least, it can help us explain to other people what we do. So if my administration or my colleague or even my students or their families want to know, well, why do we do things the way we do in our classes? Having some recourse to some of this research can help me make my point, not as in to hit people over the head with it, but give them something credible and concrete to refer back to. So that's kind of the reason why we're bothering to share all this stuff anyway. And I'm guessing one or more of these is a reason why you're curious about this stuff.
And here's our plan.
So the way we've organized this session is according to five, there could be more, but five specific principles of what's sometimes called acquisition-driven instruction, that is teaching in a way that's rich and comprehensible input and interaction. And we've singled out five of sort of the most famous or most key principles of teaching the way we do. And then for each one, we will supply some a little bit of brain research and or some linguistic research, depending on what's pertinent to that specific point, and we'll give some classroom application. And so those logos will appear in the top right corner of many of the slides. The brain, the speaking, and the teacher logo will appear in the top right of many of the slides, letting us know kind of which aspect of that we're on. So let's go ahead and dive into that first principle, this principle of repeated exposure to linguistic input, and some of the brain basis for that, Erica.
Yay, I get to talk about the brain. So I first started learning about the brain when I was doing my postmaster's work, and I quickly became obsessed because it's so applicable not only to language learning, but to basically everything we do in our lives. So, in our brains, we have these things called neurons, which are these kind of like little balls right there, and axons. And what happens when you do anything is a neuron, or more likely a group of neurons, send signals along the axons to other neurons which sends signals to other neurons, then that causes you to do basically all the things. So if you were in the middle of a lesson and suddenly your door opens and your principal or superintendent, or maybe both, walk into the room, all sorts of neurons fire and do all sorts of things at once. One recognizes the sound, another set turns your head, another set realizes who's there and responds appropriately. Because we're all teachers, another set probably scans the room to make sure that everyone is hopefully well engaged. And we're very, very quick at doing these things because the brain is sort of like a muscle, and that the parts we use become stronger and faster. In fact, with practice, our brain can process up to 100 times faster. So the things that we're very used to doing, like reacting to a sound, surveying our students, responding to a face, we're very, very, very fast at. We're very good at sending those signals. And there's the neurons and there's the axon. However, when we are doing a challenging new activity, like learning an instrument, playing a sport, juggling, or learning a new language, it causes our brain to create new pathways between neurons or to strengthen existing ones. This is hard work for our brain, and our brains don't want to do it unless we're really engaged or interested or find that the activity we're going to go and do is going to be very, very meaningful. So, has anyone ever, and you can just respond in the chat, been starting to juggle or learn a new instrument or play a new sport or learn a new language? And at first, it's really kind of frustrating and you don't really enjoy it, but then you start to practice a little more and you start to enjoy it. And then you practice more and then you get good at it and then you enjoy it more. And then eventually you find yourself actually enjoying the thing. Has anyone had that experience? And I'm hoping someone in the chat will say yes. So I know that your brains are engaged. Yay! Thank you, Rebecca. So yes, thank you, Justin. People have had that experience, and that's how our brain works. As we start to build up those connections between neurons, we get faster at processing, it gets less difficult for us, and we start to enjoy it more. And that frustration can become the practice reward cycle if we work with our brain in the right way. If we're not interested, like if you're kind of bored right now, you're probably thinking about maybe a snack you can get or your next cup of coffee or what you're going to do later. But when we are interested, our brains can be engaged at their best learning in their best learning manner. So if we use our brains naturally adapted learning capabilities, we can greatly increase learning potential and enjoyment. Yes, like climbing a mountain. Exactly, Teresa. Teresa said it's like climbing a mountain.
So a quick excursus on what we mean by input, and in this case, comprehensible input, and I'll tie that in a bit to the repeated firing of neurons that Erica just described. Just to make sure we're on the same page, by comprehensible input, we mean basically anytime someone communicates something, says or writes something in a target language, and someone else understands it. That's an instance of comprehensible input. And so another way to just say it is communication, because if a person didn't understand it, then communication hasn't happened. And so most, maybe all of us have this goal of having actual communication happen in our classrooms. Part of it is because actual communication is the goal, but part of it is also because of this research that actual communication is the cause of acquiring a language. And there's kind of a key distinction to notice here if you click that right arrow there or space bar, which is that there's a difference between language as an actual instance of communication and descriptions of language or facts about language. What we're focused on when we talk about this repeated exposure to comprehensible input is instances of communicating in a language. That doesn't mean we can't spend any time doing explanations, but the kind of learning that happens from explanations about language, you can picture, and researchers tell us to picture, is happening on kind of a completely separate track as the acquisition of a language that happens through understanding communication. And we'll get deeper into that as we go through here. If you go ahead and advance that next button, basically the theory is that every single time you encounter input in a language and you understand it, the brain tightens that connection between the form of what you heard or read and what it means. And if that connection, that link between form and meaning happens enough times, it becomes permanent, basically. And this, you can go and advance, Erica. This principle that, you can go ahead and put up the quote too, Erica. This principle that repeated exposure over and over again to language that you understand, that is the most crucial thing in the process of acquiring a language, is utterly uncontroversial, which is nice to know. In other words, among linguists, there's 100% agreement that this is the premier way that a person learns a new language, acquires a new language. That doesn't mean that there's nothing left to talk about. Researchers are still talking about, and we're all still experimenting in our classrooms. Well, is there a certain kind of input that students pay attention to best? Is there a certain kind of input where students need even less exposure to get to that point of having to be permanent and so on? So it's not like the conversation's completely closed, but there is agreement on this idea that if you are a learner and you want to acquire a language, then what you got to do is get lots and lots of comprehensible input that you understand. And if you want to help someone else learn a language, then your main job is exposing your students to that kind of input. We can go ahead and advance. I mentioned this idea of the form meaning connection. This is what I was mentioning before, is every time a learner hears language or reads language and is able in that moment to connect it with what it actually means, that counts as one of those instances that Erica was talking about of repeated firing that will build up over time to making that learning permanent. And so that can happen in all kinds of, can and does happen in all kinds of language using activities, but a really, really concrete one to get the point across here among teachers, but also with students, is the form meaning connection that's established in TPR, or total physical response. I won't go into a ton of detail on that here, because this afternoon I have an entire presentation about TPR and PQA, personal question and answer. So we'll go into more detail there, but you may recall that in TPR, usually it involves the teacher saying something. The most basic level is the teacher giving a command and students doing a physical action. And you can see how that makes a really, really direct link between the form of the word. What does it sound like? How does it end? And so on. And the action, because people are literally physically making an action associated with that. And by the way, that doesn't have to be just making a verb command and then students are doing that verb. There's actually been enough research to show. So TPR, again, it means total physical response. Maybe someone can type that in the chat for us as well. It's a technique developed by a guy named James Asher all the way back in the 60s and 70s, although I'm sure language teachers have been doing it for as long as speaking has been a thing. In other words, associating a physical action with a word. Because I have a whole presentation on this later on today, the only other thing I'll say about this is a cool piece of research, which is that how obvious the actual sign or the actual physical action is in comparison to what the word means. So for example, if the word is walk, the action associated can be someone walking in place. It can be someone just doing kind of a walking motion with their fingers like this, or it can be an almost random physical action as long as you establish with the class that that's going to stand for walk. Research shows that what makes a difference is that you make an association at all. It doesn't have to look really obviously like walking as long as you establish it. point making here where it says compound and complex TPR, which we'll get into in the TPR session this afternoon. But for those of you who have done TPR just in the form of commands like class, stand up, class, sit down slowly, class, wave, those classic basic TPR commands, there is actually a lot more that you can do with it. One quick example I'll give is I like to split a class up into two sections, two halves, and maybe this half I'll call, if it's in a Latin class, they'll be Rome, and the other half will be Carthage, Rome's sworn enemy. And now what I can do is I can give commands to or instructions just to Rome, and Carthage gets to watch and make that association between the sound they hear from me and the action they see from Rome. But it also lets me do this sort of more complex TPR. For example, I can say Carthage, after Rome stands up, clap. And then I can turn to Rome and say, stand up. They stand up. And because Carthage received the after Rome stands up, clap instruction, they can then do that. And that allows me to work in some more complex sentences and cause and effect and things like that. And that could even build up to something I'll talk about in that session, which is narrative TPR. We're actually taking that situation. Now we have these two groups and building up a little story with it. So that's kind of previews that. I hope that gets across at least a little bit of what we can mean by making this very direct connection between the form of what gets said and then what actually ensues because of what it means. Back to you, Erica.
You are muted still, Erica.
I just realized I was muted. Should we do the video really quickly, Justin? You think we have time?
Let's see. Why don't we press on just to play it safe and have this kind of in the bank if we want to then at the end go back through and share some more video examples.
That seems excellent. And just so you all know, this is an example of me doing total physical response with a classroom of first graders. So if we have time at the end, we will come back to this, but I agree, we do have a lot to cover because there's so many great things about the brain and SLA. So you want to?
Sure, I'll just comment on this really quickly because this ties back in with the TPR and also prefigures the session this afternoon. But kind of the next level up from total physical response, as far as making a direct connection between format of what's being said in the target language and the actual meaning, is starting to have actual conversations with students. And so with the expression I in Spanish, for the French teachers, that'd be il y a, German teachers, es gibt, whatever's used for kind of there, such and such exists, is we can have people memorize from a list that I means there is or there are, whatever it may be, but tying that into a personal example can make that immediate connection, make that connection between the form and the meaning even more clear. It's like, oh, what do you actually use I for? You use it for asking and answering questions like this. And you can generate lots and lots of repeated exposure by having a little conversation like this. So depending on what else, and these questions are drawn from the Voces Nuestra Historia curriculum, but whatever topic you're discussing, you could use these. So questions like, ¿hay una comida especial en tu familia? Is there a special food in your family? And asking some follow-up questions about that food or when you eat it is taking that kind of freestanding, removed from context, really common expression, I, and linking it directly to the kind of meaningful communication that it might be used in. And then, of course, we can give students sentence stems like we have here, sí hay una comida, or yes, there is, and then describe whatever the food is, no hay, etc. And you can see some other examples here and on the next slide. But we'll go into much more, I'll go much more into much more detail on the use of these kinds of things in the afternoon presentation. So let's go ahead and proceed, Erica, to the next item. If we can pause on the Bruce Lee quote, if you wish.
It's a powerful quote. I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times.
Yeah.
It's just the emphasis of really getting this usable language in the kid's head so that they can use it in a way that's comfortable, that's natural, that actually involves communicating with another human being, because that's what makes language powerful, right? being able to communicate. So we made it through our
So
first.
that's repeated exposure to input. We spent a good chunk of time on that because that's foundational it's foundational in the study of second language acquisition. And so what's required for teaching and learning a language. And it's also foundational to some of the other things that we'll talk about. And we'll delve into that even deeper now by talking about ways of really focusing on meaning so that that kind of gets locked in, while also sharing what are some opportunities and methods for focusing, helping students understand the forms of words as well along the way.
So now we're going to start with focus on meaning. So we have these two, this is one of my favorite brain things to talk about, but we have these two systems in our brain called the mentalizing system and the prefrontal cortex. And they kind of work on a teeter-totter in that when one of these systems is on, the other one is off. They're never on at the same time. The prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that kind of just involves decision making and math and like planning, forward planning. So like if you were figuring how long you needed to get ready for, the session today, or how you're going to fit everything you need for your classroom in your trunk, or how you're going to solve the math problem. That's all prefrontal cortex. The mentalizing system is a part of our brain that handles our story, our relationship to others, our place in the world. And if we think of the brain kind of like a muscle, the scientists wanted to know which side was stronger, because the brain is like a muscle in that the part that we use more often becomes stronger and faster. We kind of already stated that with the neurons and axon. So the scientists wanted to know which system of our brain we're in more. Is it the mentalizing system or the prefrontal cortex? So what they did was they put these people in two different test subjects into set of test subjects into an fMRI machine, functional magnetic resonance imaging machine. And what they did was they threw math problems at the participants something like every 30 seconds. And what they found was the participants' prefrontal cortex would light up just long enough to solve the math problem. And the second the problem was solved, it would shut down and the mentalizing system would fire back up. So the scientists concluded that the mentalizing system is the default part of our brain. It's the part that we use the most. So it should therefore be the strongest. They went a step further and they gave these test subjects a test. And what they did was with group A, they said, you're going to read this description of an imaginary person, like the description of a man, and you are going to take a test on this description. So you're going to have to tell us everything you can about this imaginary person you just read about in a test. And group A, when they read about this imaginary person, used their prefrontal cortex to take in this information. Group B was told, okay, you're going to read about this person and you are going to set them up on a blind date with one of your friends. And what they found was that group B used their mentalizing system to take in this information, because they were then associating with people they knew, with their past memories, all of this stuff. Well, both groups, group A and group B, they both took the test. Which group do you think did better? The prefrontal cortex group, the group that knew they were taking a test, or the mentalizing group, the group that thought they were going to, hook this person up on a date with one of their friends? A or B? Prefrontal or mentalizing? If you could just answer in the chat just for a little engagement. Yes, you already knew. Mentalizing system was the mentalizing system. It's because we're taking out our memories and we are associating this person with things that we already knew. We're tying it into our pre-existing information. And that is the more powerful part of our brains for acquiring new information. If you've ever been up in the middle of the night and you've been reading a really good book and all of a sudden it's 4 a.m, you were engaged in the mentalizing system. You were living that story. Right? And we can engage our students' mentalizing system when we learn languages. We're really tying into the most powerful parts of our brain for this kind of learning. So we're going to do a little experiment so you can kind of experience this for yourself. And we are going to look at 2 different readings about Teotihuacan. And this is a site in Mexico that you can go and explore. And one of these readings is designed to kind of engage your prefrontal cortex, and one is designed to engage your mentalizing system. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of time to read both of them, and then we're going to guess which one engaged which and talk about which one we find more interesting. Totally fine if you don't finish reading the whole page. This just gives you like a little taste. But here is our first reading. Reading A. I'll just give you a moment to read. There's reading A. And totally fine if you're not done. It's harder for me to tell when I'm not in a room with people. And here is reading B. Okay, which one, A or B, do you think engaged your mentalizing system? We're getting in the chat, which makes me happy. Yes, reading B was designed to engage your mentalizing system. Which one was more interesting to you, A or B? We have a few A's in there, which is great. That's a very interesting brain. But B is designed to engage your mentalizing system. And with B, you can kind of feel the hat slipping over your eyes and the cold of the tunnel. And you can feel like this small space. And that's engaged, is designed to engage your mentalizing system. Whereas with A, when they're talking about how everything is set up, that engages your prefrontal cortex. Now, we did have a couple of answers with A, and there is nothing wrong with that. That just means you have a very active prefrontal cortex, and those are wonderful brains too. It's just a different way of thinking. But this type of reading where we are, and both types are important, but this type of reading where we're kind of experiencing it and living through it is kind of a great way to hook us in and get us wanting to read more about what we are experiencing. So we already, I kind of already did this slide. We talked about which text activated the mentalizing system, which made us want to keep reading. And stories activate our mentalizing system. That's why, as I said a few minutes ago, I kind of gave away this slide early too. When you're in the middle of a really great book or a really great story and it's the middle of the night and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it's already 4 a.m. because you were just reading and you were living in a whole other world. That is your mentalizing system being activated. I had a student many years ago she was a 3rd grader and she was showing her little brother my classroom, who was a kindergartner, an incoming kindergartner. And she was like, these are our toys and these are our books and these are our costumes. And we speak in Spanish in here the whole time, but mostly I just forget that we're speaking in Spanish. And that just made my heart sing because that's what you want it to be. You want them to be so engaged that they almost don't even realize they're in another language. And when we set up our classrooms the right way, we really can do that for our students. Stories are a powerful way of sharing information. We've been doing it since ancient times. They're an essential form of communication for our species. They help us to empathize with others, to put our feet in other shoes, to understand other people, and to live things we haven't lived yet. And they strengthen our memories. So the brain can experience a story in a state of flow, focusing entirely on the meaning. And that's that little girl saying, oh yeah, we speak in Spanish, but I forget. And that's when you're in the middle of a great show or a great book and you forget the time because you're just so engaged in what you're doing. That's a really powerful way of engaging our brains and learning.
Thank you, Erica. So tying this into some linguistic research and classroom practice, I have just one short point about from the linguistic side. Think back to that the idea of that form meaning connection that we were talking about, and how in the context of a story and what's being communicated in the story, as long as it's a level appropriate story, in other words, linguistically level appropriate, and or we as teachers supply just enough help for students to be understanding what's going on in the story, then we're helping students engage with that meaning that helps their brains make the link between, I see this word is showing up like this in the story. I know that it means this. And so that form meaning connection is happening that moves students towards the permanent learning of whatever that feature is. If you advance to this point right here, there's a really interesting. This is unlike the things that I was saying before that are pretty much universally agreed upon by researchers about the primacy of comprehensible input for acquiring a language. This one is a bit more cutting edge, but it's basically that the idea is that when using the frontal cortex system that Erica was talking about, that we can do that with respect to things about language. In other words, we can learn rules about how language is laid out. We can learn charts that lay out language in a certain way. And those are using the prefrontal cortex, as in we engage with that information using the prefrontal cortex. But there's reason to think that while we're engaged in that way, we have actually shut off the parts of the brain that acquire a language because language works more with that mentalizing system. In other words, if we want the parts and processes of students' brains to kick in where they process the meaning of language and where they make form and meaning connections, we need to get them over into the mentalizing system where they are attempting to process meaning, attempting to either to figure out what a text means or what something they hear means, or they're maybe processing it in real time because it's already at a level that they can understand. Now, again, this is a little bit more cutting edge. Not every single person would agree with this because it's hard to establish. It's difficult to prove this, but it does reinforce this idea of focusing as much as possible on meaning. Now, does this mean, and I hinted beforehand that we would get at, does this mean we can never focus on the actual form in which something is being said, or that we completely ignore that sometimes words have different endings or things like that? No, it just means we want to do the instruction that relates to those things in the context of a meaning-focused activity. And one of the best ways to do that is in the context of a text, such as the ones that Erica was sharing. So if you, well, let's actually go on to the next slide, Erica, because I think that'll make it a bit more clear. So when do we actually want to focus on form? Remember, because the key is this form meaning connection, is that the best time to focus in on why does the word have the form it does is when communication breaks down. In other words, either a learner falsely understands or misunderstands what's being said, or a learner is trying to express something, but they're not able to because they can't come up with the forms that are involved in what they're specifically trying to say. Those are the best opportunities to help students with different forms of words. And I'll give you several examples actually in a moment, in a way that still puts meaning first, not just because meaning is more important or something like that, but because of the evidence that it's in that meaning focused context where the process called acquiring a language can actually happen. So here's how this, if you go to the next slide, Erica, here's how this could look in practice in a language class. How can we focus in on form in the context of meaning? So for example, if you're reading a text, and in Spanish, there's this difference between tiene, meaning has, and tienes, meaning you have. If there's a text that includes both those words, we can pause and say, now class, how come it says tiene here, but tienes over there? And have it ever so quick, depending on how much students have internalized it. It might be, take only a split second, student raise your hand and says, oh, because there it's talking about someone having a thing. And there where it says tienes, it's saying to someone, you have the thing. That would be a great way to kind of point out the impact of those different forms on meaning. Another example from French, maybe there's a certain word there and you're at, maybe it's tout, and meaning all, and say, hey, what would it what would it mean if it said tut instead? Or why would it say tut? Or maybe why does it say tu here, but tut there? For the non-French speakers, that has to do with the masculine and feminine forms of all. And that would be a way in the context of the meaning that's being expressed in that passage to call attention to that difference. Last but not least, if in the other situation, so the first two examples are there's a text or there's a video or something, there's input, and we're calling attention to a certain aspect of the input. This third example is when a student themselves is trying to express something and there's a breakdown because of a misused form. In other words, the student accidentally says something that kind of doesn't mean anything, or accidentally says something that actually means something different than what they're trying to say. So if I ask a student, do you have a cat? ¿Tienes un gato? And they reply, sí, tienes un gato, which they're replying then, yes, you have a cat, back to me, but what they're probably trying to express is that they themselves have a cat. And so I can use this form of, oh, okay, now what you said means you have a cat. Is that what you're going for? And I say, oh no, I'm not trying to say I have a cat. And I say, okay, in that case, it's tengo. And I can write that on the board, rewrite it on the board, and give that assistance. So you, of course, don't have to word your intervention exactly this way, but something like this, what are you saying this? Are you trying to say this? And here's how you say the thing you're trying to say can be a great way to bring in focus on form. Again, it's in the context of a student actually trying to express something, in that case, trying to express something about themselves, which makes it meaning focused and may also make it more memorable because it's specifically something about themselves they're trying to express, although there could be other contexts where you provide this kind of support as well.
Okay, so one way that we like to provide support at VOCEs, and we're not going to go into all of the things that you can do with the story right now because I, much like Justin has a total physical response and personal question answer session, I have a story from start to finish session, which I'm going to go into all the details. But this is an example of one of our stories, and it's the heroes of the airplane, and it's about this father-son team who takes tourists over the Nazca Lines in Peru, and they kind of save them from being vandalized by some tourists. And it's a really exciting story. And so it's a great way to get your students excited and like into the moment and into the mentalizing system with the story. But then also it's a doorway and an opening to talk about the Nazca Lines in Peru and to start to get into the culture. So we really try to provide you at VOCEs with the stories that you need to get your students both connecting to the story and to the language, but also to the culture of the languages we are learning. This particular story is a great example too of jumping from like the story in the mentalizing system to the prefrontal cortex and to actually learning some information about the things, because we also have leveled articles in each of our chapters that go with one of the themes for the chapter or the country that we're talking about. And these ones happen to be about the Nazca Lines in Peru. And you'll see that there is a version A, a version B, and a version C for each of these. And what I really love about these, just to not to go off on a whole tangent, but you can have all of your students reading about the same interesting cultural topic, but at a place that's just right for them. So sometimes what I like to do with these is to print them and to let my students self-select, like pick the one that you think that matches your reading level. And it's really great to see kids diving into the harder text when they're super interested in it, and to see what students will do with that when they get to self-select. But also you can start with version A, which is very small and very basic and is not going to overwhelm students, and then build a version B and build a version C so the students feel really, really accomplished reading about this same topic, where we start with 75 words and they get all the way to 184 words. And they get to learn about the Nazca Lines, which is super cool. And then we have stories. This is just to show you that we have stories at all levels for different students. This is one in French because we don't want to just give you examples in Spanish, so we can meet your students right where they're at. And one of my favorite things about the Voces platform, a little side note, is that when you get access to one level, you have access to all levels within the language. And so if you have students who are heritage speakers or advanced speakers and you need to give them something harder, you can pull from the upper level text. Whereas if you have students who are just beginning or just moved in, you can pull from the more basic texts. So you can support each brain right where it's at. And one more plug for the cuteness and for engaging students. We also have interviews throughout our series with native speakers from all over the world. And this one is Lara, and she was absolutely adorable. And she's talking about the weather in Chile. I know, Rachel, oh my goodness, is right. She's absolutely adorable, and the kids love her. And she talks about some exciting things with weather. And then the students get a chance to talk about the weather themselves. And they get to hear from someone who lives in a different place and make a connection, which is always so important. And that's just a transcript. Sometimes you can let the kids read at the same time as they listen. Justin, you want to dive in here? I agree.
Sure, yeah. So we've made it through kind of the two biggest, most core topics. We'll dive into variety and novelty, which is a fairly quick point to make, but there's some but it's handy to keep in mind, and it's cool to know about some of the options and the many options we have for bringing in some variety and novelty. Because if we're going to provide lots and lots of exposure to input, then we want it to be repeated, but we don't want it to be repetitive, right? Because that can get boring. If people check out, then they're not actually comprehending and processing that input. So we'll discuss here briefly kind of this idea of variety and novelty and some ways to get it, and then we'll proceed with the huge topic of stress.
And I am doing a whole session on the last day about avoiding stress for teachers, just to throw that out there because that's another topic that is near and dear to my heart. So novelty in the brain. We always hear, activate prior knowledge when we're talking to our students, but why? And what they have found is subjects perform best in tests when new information was combined with familiar information during learning. After a 20-minute delay, subjects' memory for slightly familiar information was boosted by 19%. That is a significant boost. That's a significant boost. If it had been mixed with new facts during learning sessions. So basically, that's just the plug for, we want to make sure that we are giving the students novelty. So their brains are like, ooh, I want to pay attention, right? And getting them excited and engaged about learning. But also, we don't want to overwhelm them with like giant lists of words or new information, because then the brain just shuts down and says, I can't do this. I'm just going to sit here quietly and hope nobody notices that I'm not paying attention. So it's really important that we find the balance between novelty, like, ooh, this is new and exciting, but also mixing it with prior information, just like the mentalizing system does when we take out our memories and mix new things in, because we want the students to feel comfortable with what they're learning, but also excited about it. Oh, Justin, you're muted.
Will you actually pause and go back to that slide for one moment, the one that you were describing?
Yeah.
So it took me like 6 times of reading this to understand kind of what the point was here. It seems like what this study's demonstrated is like, make sure that you review old stuff in with the new stuff, which is a point we all know to do. What this study is actually adding is almost like the opposite, is that working in new stuff doesn't just expose you to new stuff, it helps you understand the old stuff better too. So like really clear, because it took me so many times to get this. What they're literally saying is that like simply repeating previous information leads to remembering that information less well than if you repeat that information and throw in a couple new things, which is really fascinating, because you'd think that that one would be like more complicated, it would confuse people and stuff like that. But there's something about the extra attention or new connections or something that's supplied by having that new information that not only helps people start learning that new information, but actually solidifies the learning for the old information too. So again, it took me like a while to wrap my head around. So maybe you all kind of caught that already, but just in case. Okay, let's go to the next one. And Erica, I'd love to try something. Would you exit out of the presentation for a second and then just restart the slideshow in case it helps with the formatting on some of those items, where you can just click to start the slideshow again.
Okay.
I think that might do it. No, we still got it. So on my screen, just so you all know, and maybe we'll share the version that I have on my screen, we don't have these kind of odd line breaks, but hopefully it'll still, the idea will still come across. So go ahead and proceed, Erica. Let's throw up that word cat there. Okay, that time it worked. So we know what the word cat means, right? It's a certain animal. It's usually whiskered. There are two hiding somewhere in the house where I am right now. They're rarely seen anymore since we got our puppy, Birdie, but they're here, right? We know what cat means, but here's the thing: this is super cool, and so my academic background is in linguistics, and so one of the topics I was most fascinating about this idea of what word meanings. Words have a definition, right? If we look them up, but a lot of what a word means in a certain situation comes from its context, and the reason why I mention it here is we want to have variety, not just for the sake of novelty, but also because if we only have a couple contexts in which students encounter certain words or phrases, then they're only going to be picking up whatever that narrow usage of the word is, and not what it means in lots of other contexts. And I don't just mean I don't just mean things like that the word table can mean a thing you eat off, and in a different context, it can be like a chart with information. I mean, something even more, even wilder than that. So if we add an S to this word with the next slide, Erica, if we add an S, okay, now we know that this is, well, you type in the chat, what does this do to it? What does it mean now that it didn't mean before? Yes, we see more than one cat. It's plural. There are more than one. Exactly. So we all kind of get this. However, if you go and advance to the next one there, now if I say cats are goofy, so lots of people put more than one, but I can't substitute the phrase more than one cat in here and have it mean the same thing, right? If I say cats are goofy, I'm not just saying more than one cat is goofy, because that could be like two cats or three cats. In English, this way of phrasing it actually means I'm saying cats in general are goofy, right? But very few of us, if we just talk about, okay, adding on an S in English, we would just say, oh, that's how you make it plural. Most of us haven't even learned a rule or a use of English that you can add an S onto a word and say that you're talking about that type of thing in general. That kind of makes sense. I'm not trying to make it like a super heady point, but this is just like a one locus, one spot where we can make a point that's actually, even with something as simple as the plural S, there can be way more going on, way more that's shared meaning-wise. Now, if we add one more word, and we say the cats are goofy, now suddenly in English, it no longer means cats in general, it means some specific cats, right? Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. Exactly, the specific cats. Maybe it's if I say to my partner Ashley, "Hey, do you know where the cats are?" I'm not asking about all the cats on the planet. I mean the two that live in our house, right? And so it can mean those specific ones. In fact, in that sentence, if I say, "Do you know where the cats are?" the word "the" actually kind of means our, right? Do you know where our cats are? But you never learn in a textbook that one meaning of the word "the" is our. If I say, hey, can you pick up the kids? I don't just mean all the children. I specifically mean like our kids or my kids, right? And so this is a kind of very simple sentence, but it's specifically kind of bringing back to us language nerds. Wow, even these tiny little things that we never learn as a rule in a textbook or something like that are things that people who know English, because they've been exposed to it enough, they know, right? All of you knew when I said that cats are goofy, it meant like cats in general. When I added the, it meant specific ones that I was talking about or at my house or something like that. But these are things that learners need to acquire, partly because they're just part of the language, but also because they work a little differently in different languages. Like the articles in the Romance languages, French and Spanish, for example, are used sometimes where we wouldn't use one in English, and vice versa. So even those little things are things that we need lots of varied exposure to get the hang of. On the topic of novelty and variety, you'll have this link shared with you many times, but BOSIS has a resource, totally free resource called The Hub that had lots and lots of teaching ideas. And the reason why we dropped in some examples here under novelty and variety is because, for example, whether you use BOSIS or not, you're probably going to be working with texts a lot, maybe stories a lot. And in the hub, you don't want to, I'm sure you have some of your favorite ways of working with stories, but you probably don't want to always do the same thing. So in the hub, we have things like 20 things you can do after reading a story, or 5 things to do before reading a story, so that you can achieve some of the same things. In other words, students dwelling on a story a bit and working with it, but in a way that brings in some of that novelty and variety. That's the thing, again, we can share the link to later on.
Okay, I'm going to briefly talk about one of my favorite ways to engage students in the hub that's low teacher prep. That was always a huge hit with my students. And you can do it with students at all levels. And that is having them retell a story with a comic strip. Now, we have these comic strips in the BOSAS platform for you. But obviously, if you are not a BOSAS user, you can just use any link comic strip. And what you're just having them do is retell whatever story that you just told. For my beginners, like maybe beginners, what I would do is I would just take one of these and I would write out the story for them and just make copies of that. And then they are reading and drawing. And it's really, really quick to look through the papers and see like what details they understood, what they didn't, where they're at with their comprehension. For my slightly more advanced students, what I usually do is I write out parts of the story for them and give them a word bank so they can plug in some of the words and then again draw the pictures. For my next level students, I have them write the story themselves and draw the pictures. And then for my most advanced students, they write the story, they change a detail about the story. They could change the main character, they could change what happened, but just some detail about the story, and they draw the pictures. And then I take these and I print them out, and I take the student comic strips and I put them in a binder, and that becomes free voluntary reading for students. And they love to go and reread these stories. And it's a story that they've already read, and so they feel comfortable with it. But seeing all of the different pictures that their classmates have drawn or the tiny changes their classmates have made provides that novelty to the students without you having to do very much at all. So it is low teacher prep, but you can get so much out of this, both from extra repetitions, novelty, and then the students get to read it extra, so it goes into your free voluntary reading library. So it's sort of all of the things. And then also, you can send, just like a little PR thing you can do, is send these stories home with students and have them tell their parents the story. And oh my gosh, my parents always loved this. They would say, oh, my second grader speaks more Spanish than I did after 4 years of college, because they would be so impressed. When I send these home with students, I always send them the first time with a parent letter that says, your student's a beginning language learner. They are trying to, get into this language. Let's resist the urge to correct them, and let's just be really positive about what they have learned. And the parents just have to tell me in English what the student told them, and then sign off and give their student a compliment. And the students come back glowing because their parents are like, wow, my kid knows so much language. And the parents are glowing because, wow, their kid knows so much language. And it's very, very little teacher prep. So it's kind of all the things in one. It's a super favorite if you can't tell. And then one other that I really, really love from the hub is backstory. And what you do is you basically take any character from your story. Here you could take the axolotl or even one of the plants or even the water itself, and you have students make a backstory for it. And so what I would do is I would have my students draw the character they were making the backstory for, and then they would have 5 sentence starters around the character that were things I wanted them to practice, like my name is, I have this many years, I like, I don't like, I'm going, I am from. And then they fill out the information they know, and they make up the information they don't. And again, you can throw it in a binder. Students will read these over and over and over, and they get to be creative and get a little bit of new material, some novelty, but lots of repetitions of the important stuff. So it kind of mixes all of my favorite things together. Is Justin still with us?
Yeah, so we're going to close by considering this topic of stress-free learning. When we share the slides, you'll see a bit more about patience in the process. That's kind of more an overarching thing, but I really want to make sure that you hear one specific point from Erica and one specific point from me that are memorable and helpful on this topic of stress-free learning, keeping stress down as not just an ideal, but an essential thing for learning in general and for language learning in particular. So go ahead, Erica.
Okay. So the amygdala, when we are stressed out, the amygdala is in charge of our freeze, fight, or flight reaction. When it's activated, new sensory information cannot pass through it to access the memory and association circuits. This is kind of a mind-blowing thing, but social pain and physical pain actually activate the same centers in our brain. In our brains, the only difference between social and physical pain is that a second part of our brain with physical pain will light up to tell us where in our bodies we hurt. But the part of our brain that tells us how much we hurt, whether it's an elephant stepping on your foot or your friend saying, I'm not eating lunch with you, but that part of our brain that says how much we hurt, it's the same, whether it's social pain or physical pain. So they actually found, and I'm going to resist telling you the whole study, but they actually found in a double-blind study that ibuprofen can dull social pain the same way it dulls physical pain. And that's because the part of our brain that tells us how much something hurts is the same, whether it's social pain or physical pain. Again, the only difference is that with physical pain, a second part of our brain lights up to tell us where in our bodies we hurt. So when we don't feel like we belong or we are afraid of being wrong, we just cannot learn as well. Our brains are not as prepared to learn. So that's why I know we always hear like, create a safe learning environment, but this is why we actually don't learn as well when we don't feel safe. On the flip side of that, when we feel like we are in that kind of we love school, exuberant kindergarten like atmosphere, positive motivation impacts brain metabolism, the conduction of nerve impulses through the memory areas, and the release of neurotransmitters and increased executive function and attention. In other words, when we feel comfortable, when we feel safe, we don't feel like we have to protect ourselves, we just are in our best state for learning. And I'm going to skip the next slide so Justin can get in his point too.
So this will be the image that I leave you with. If we think back to that issue of making connections between form and meaning over and over again, in order to have language acquisition happen, we run into one problem, and all learning situations actually run into this problem. And it's a question of how well does any given learning situation solve it? And it's called the working memory problem, which is basically that the human brain can only hold so many things in mind at the same time. And so in a learning situation, that might be how is this, if I'm the learner, okay, how's this activity supposed to work? It might be something distracting that's happening over here. It might be the meaning of whatever I'm reading and also the forms of all those words. All those things are kind of like going on in my brain at the same time, and it doesn't take much for the brain to get overloaded. Specifically, a lot of studies have found over time, I think if you advance it, that it's basically about 7 things plus or minus 2, depending on how you divvy things up, that the brain can kind of hold on balance at the same time. It's kind of tabs that the brain can have open at the same time without crashing. Now, here's the thing. In order to make that form-meaning connection, you got to have at least 2 of those slots open for the form of whatever you're reading or hearing and the meaning of it so that your brain can make that connection. However, if you're stressed, the 2 bad things happen. First of all, being stressed actually reduces the capacity, that reduces the number of slots that your brain can use in order to pay attention, in order to participate in learning. So already you have fewer slots available, which reduces the odds that you can make these form and meaning connections, especially if you're already trying to keep in mind, how does this new activity work or some other thing. And then on top of that, go ahead, Erica, one more. On top of that, hit it one more time. There we go. On top of that, if you're not just stressed, but you're actively thinking about something you're stressed about, like you're thinking about something someone said to you, or you're thinking about the test you have coming up, or some other issue, then that is also kind of using up slots, and you're already reduced number of slots that you have available due to being stressed. And what this means, similar to the lesson that both JJ and Erica shared about the amygdala just simply not letting information through, what this means is if a student is in the situation, kind of the high stress situation or high stress learning environment, and they're not picking up the language or they're not understanding what's going on, it's not necessarily because they're not paying attention or not smart enough or something like that. Their brain might just literally be out of slots in which to balance the form and meaning of words. So that we can't do much about the stressors that students have outside of class. There are lots of those things that are out of our control. But what it does mean is, as far as it depends on us within our class sessions, to keep that stress low. Some of that is just being a decent human, being kind, not kind of avoiding, in my case, my inclination to be sarcastic sometimes, different things like that to keep stress low. But there are other ways as well that we can keep those down. And you'll see some of those throughout the workshop this week. You'll also see some in these slides when they get shared with you. The next several slides are about different ways of taking students' stress levels into account and kind of moderating or mediating with those as well. So be on the lookout for that when you explore these slides. If you want to get in touch with Erica or me directly, you can use those Erica PB or Justin SB. Like if it's a topic specific to some of this brain or second language acquisition research, you can always get in touch, of course, with info@vocesdigital.com and direct a question that would make it to us or to whoever else you might want to get that info from. And thanks for sharing those things in the chat as well there too, Hannah. So thank you, everybody. I know this is a dense presentation. I hope it provided you with some kind of interesting or satisfying scientific tidbits, as well as some thoughts and actual classroom teaching ideas. You get lots more of all those things throughout the day and the presentation as well, of course.
Yes, thank you so much for spending your time with us, and we hope to see you later in another presentation.
Mm-hmm.